Story 1. Jeffrey and Michael Derderian, the brothers who owned Rhode Island's Station nightclub at the time of the 2003 fire that left 100 people dead, stated that the nightclub was not crowded beyond legal capacity, complied with all fire safety rules. They did not know that the band Great White would be using pyrotechnics in their show, and they thought the sound-insulating foam on the walls was non-flammable. A supplier had mistakenly sent them highly flammable foam that was visually identical to the correct type. Story 2. Marie Antoinette. She was married and placed upon the throne before she turned 20. She was in a loveless marriage, and as the second youngest of 16 children, she had no diplomatic skills. She was married off to avoid war with France and had no friends. I do not know about you, but if I were in her shoes, I would also spend the national budget on fancy clothes and other things. Poor girl had no clue what she was doing. Story 3. Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Nowadays, whenever Lovecraft is mentioned, at least on the internet, you'll have plenty of people jumping in to remind everyone what his cat's name was. Don't get me wrong, he was absolutely, undeniably racist, and no amount of personal trauma can excuse that. He was a sheltered, sickly, terrified, depressed man. Both of his parents died in mental institutions, and he was constantly either physically or mentally unwell, often going into deep depressions and withdrawing. Despite all that, once he actually started traveling and broadening his social circle, his bigotry greatly lessened. He started out as a pro-monarchy Tory who hated anyone who didn't try to assimilate into Western culture and died as a socialist in favor of all ethnicities preserving their culture. He even talked very negatively about his earlier beliefs and prejudices as he got older. He was far from perfect, but he was improving. You know how there are people who started out nice, but as they got older, they just became more and more hateful to the point that part of you wishes they died years ago before they had completely destroyed their legacy? Lovecraft is like the opposite of that. He started out really hateful, but as he got older, he started becoming more tolerant, and I just wish he had lived long enough to see that through. Also, he had the cat when he was a child. He probably didn't even name it, but even if he did, he was just a kid. You aren't even your own person at that age. Besides, would you want to be remembered primarily for a foolish thing you did when you were a child? Story 4. People with behavioral or social issues. There is often a reason people behave the way they do that is considered outside of the norm, and it is typically not their fault. People are often dealt difficult situations, and we have no idea what they have experienced. Everyone should practice more empathy. Story 5. Drug addicts are just mentally ill people whose coping mechanism happens to be drugs. If you were in their shoes and could feel the way drugs make them feel, you would be in the same boat as them. Story 6. I feel like Dr. Kevorkian is remembered as a villain, or maybe that's just my perception, but I believe he genuinely was trying to reduce suffering and help people. Story 7. Angelina Jolie. She devotes her life to her family and charity work. She left Brad Pitt after he physically assaulted her and their son, but somehow she is to blame for alienating her kids from their father. Story 8. Paris Hilton. She went through some hardship in the troubled teen industry. She is a massive advocate for the victims of those schools now. I have nothing but respect for her now. Story 9. Medusa was a beautiful young lady who visited the Temple of Athena. Poseidon couldn't control himself and assaulted her right there. Athena became angry because of this act occurring in her temple and unfairly blamed Medusa, turning her into a hideous monster. Additionally, Medusa's two sisters were turned into Gorgons for speaking out about her mistreatment. Medusa and her sisters were so shunned by gods and mortals alike that they resorted to living in a cave in the middle of nowhere. The twist is that Perseus rises to mythic fame by waiting until all three sisters are asleep and then chopping their heads off. Real hero. Thanks for pointing out it's Perseus, not Heracles, who is instructed to kill the Gorgons. Story 10. No, there isn't a global conspiracy to do something terrible to people. Outside of certain countries, we aren't paid enough for wholesale cruelty to even be worth considering. Thus, while there is job security, the reason most of us do it is that we want to help people. I'm not going to get paid more if you take my advice or not. I cannot force you to do anything to better your health or the health of your kids. I can report you if I think there are mental competency or safety issues, but even then, Even involuntary psychiatric treatment cannot be used to force you to do anything but get enough treatment to be deemed mentally competent to make decisions about non-mental health conditions. It can't be used to make you have, for example, cancer treatment, but if we can get you mental well enough and you still refuse treatment, we have to abide by that. I had a case like that go through multiple hearings, medical legal consultations, and a high court hearing about a periodically psychotic patient with treatable kidney cancer that will kill them without treatment, but they decline cancer treatment during psychotic breaks. We also don't stop being human as soon as we qualify. We don't know everything, and even with all the medical school training, exams, and specialty training, we will still get things wrong. We will misdiagnose because human bodies don't care about anatomy or physiology textbooks. We might hear hooves and think horses as the most likely source while considering cattle might be possible. But the hooves might just be bison. Even in Bournemouth, catastrophic mistakes are rarely due to one individual. There usually has to be a series of mistakes that add up to tragedy when the entire hospital system checks fail. Unfortunately, when cases are publicized, the media, the medical governing body, and sometimes the hospital itself try to find a scapegoat when many more people and sometimes the hospital itself need to be held to account. This has resulted in unjust dismissals, loss of license, and suicide of the accused individual, simply due to the stress of investigation with lack of support. When we give medical prognosis, we do so to give patients and their loved ones a time frame to get their affairs in order and think about estate planning. We are not, in fact, placing an expiry date on humans. Unless we actually actively kill that person, we are giving a probability based on statistical data from hundreds, thousands, or more cases with the same condition. There will be outliers with some dying earlier and some lasting much longer. Living beyond the prognosis is often reported as patients defying doctors, as if we don't want you to actually have the best outcomes. We predicted you had a year and you made it to 4? We are happy you're still alive. You will be added to the audit data, but it isn't going to make a huge difference to the prognosis given to future patients, unless a large number start living long enough to shift the stats. I had one patient last 14 years with prostate cancer that had metastasized to his bones. His bone scans were terrifying, but he lived a long time. He was a significant outlier, and most patients in the same condition have about 18 months to 2 years. It would be negligent of me to instill that kind of false hope in other patients. In summary, most doctors want to help you. We aren't the enemy. Some of us could do with better bedside manners, but even the difficult ones want to fix you, if only to stroke their own egos. We also make mistakes because we are human. Story 11. Joseph Robinette Biden oversaw an almost miraculous economic recovery from COVID-19, navigating us down from a dangerous global inflation spike while reducing unemployment and raising low-income wages and reducing inequality, something the economic professional consensus thought would be impossible, all while competently managing the distribution of hundreds of millions of vaccine doses, allowing the country to reopen. He also ended the drone war and America's longest-running war in Afghanistan, with barely any American casualties. However, he is so old he can barely communicate in public, and few people understand this, so blame him for the problems he solved, such as COVID-19 lockdowns, inflation, and the Afghan quagmire. And it means next time there is a hint of inflation, policymakers will choose austerity, mass unemployment, and widespread misery. Story 12. People with undiagnosed or even diagnosed mental disorders, specifically ones that affect your entire personality and well-being, like autism, for example. I wish everyone researched the traits and was nice about it. Cringy interests are okay. It's not the end of the world if someone looks crazy for wearing headphones all the time or has clothing with characters they like on it. If someone talks slightly weird, if someone gets overwhelmed or shuts down in public, stop being so judgmental. Also, crying or getting upset in public does not equal doing it for attention. People are so cruel to things they don't understand. An adult carries around a plush animal because it helps them with their anxiety. Shame on them for finding something that helps them that doesn't affect anyone else. Everyone dogpile and tell them to never go outside. That'll show them. Story 13. I think there are some rude vegans, but for the most part, vegans just try to live a life that aligns with our morals, and I think a lot of people take offense to that because of their own personal issues. Story 14. People with anxiety. My best friend talks excessively in certain social situations that make her anxious. As a result, some people lose patience with her or even say mean or hateful things about her, either to her face or behind her back. I stand up for her if she's directly insulted because it's totally unnecessary to be so hostile over a social mistake. Anxiety is a painful affliction, and I feel bad for people who suffer from it. I don't think many people are understanding or even aware of why someone with anxiety is acting the way they are, whether it's being super quiet, talking excessively, or just acting a bit off. It's easy to judge until you've experienced it firsthand. Story 15. I might get downvoted to oblivion, but Michael Jackson. I think he was psychologically damaged beyond repair and stunted from his childhood, and his coping mechanisms involved some awful judgments that regular, well-adjusted people may not be able to fully comprehend. I think that, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement, if he were truly a prolific pedophile, there would be hundreds of victims, not just two. Story 16. Seth MacFarlane. He is actually an excellent person who just has a kind of gross sense of humor. He is a regular huge donor to labor rights movements, the Democratic National Committee, and women's rights movements. He has never had a scandal. None of his exes have anything negative to say about him, and he uses his influence to ensure people working on his shows are well paid. We all just dislike him because he's kind of gross. Story 17. Eileen Vormus. I know she was a serial killer of men, but when you look at her life, it's tragic. Not a single good thing happened to her, and she was abused and raped over and over again before she snapped. When she was arrested, she asked to be put to death and didn't contest any charges. Devastating life, in my opinion. Story 18. Michael Cimino is often credited with ending the new Hollywood era that introduced filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, and many others. This reputation stems from the turbulent production of his film, Heaven's Gate. His career largely fell apart after the movie's epic failure upon release. In reality, Star Wars and Jaws had already begun to shift studios and producers away from auteur-driven films to more producer-driven ones. The depressing and gritty films of the new Hollywood era had been losing momentum for years. Heaven's Gate was simply a victim of bad timing. Story 19. Probably most spree shooters are not misunderstood as in we should feel sorry for them, but misunderstood as in we should have a better understanding of why they do what they do so we can fix it as a society. Story 20. As a group, criminals run the gamut from the truly despicable, who should be buried under the prison, to the truly unlucky, who probably never should have been arrested in the first place, and everything in between. But the second you have that scarlet letter C on you, everything from work to relationships becomes exponentially harder. We treat them like untouchables, give them little help, then wonder why so many do not successfully reintegrate into society. Story 21. Receipt checkers are doing what their boss told them to do. People, especially online, get upset when asked to show their receipt. One time, I was at self-checkout, and my boss told me to check the receipt of a lady with a big, expensive baby seat. I asked for her receipt, and she started accusing me of being racist because she's black, even though both my boss and I are black as well. She was ranting and raving. I didn't know if she paid for it or not, and frankly, I didn't care. It's just that my boss instructed me to do it, and he was there to make sure I followed through. We are not doing it because we care whether you stole something. We're just doing it because our bosses tell us to. So please calm down. Story 22. Emperor Nero. He was likely a little dramatic and full of himself, but he didn't play the fiddle as Rome burned. He wasn't even in Rome when it burned, and as soon as he heard the news, he came back immediately to coordinate rebuilding efforts. Overall, he was a decent leader who was popular among the people. It was the elites who didn't like him and slandered his name after he died. Story 23. People laugh at Sigmund Freud a lot. And don't get me wrong, in hindsight, a lot of what he came up with was kind of absurd, and he was doing a lot of cocaine. But the thing is, I really think he deserves a little more respect than he gets from modern psychology students and lay people. His theories of psychology were no more inaccurate than the plum pudding model of the atom, and people don't really laugh at J.J. Thomson. He has a Nobel Prize. His models were eventually superseded by something much more accurate, but his contributions were incredibly valuable and an important step along the way. The same is true for Freud, but arguably much more so. Freud really was the founder of much of modern psychology. He was the first to seriously consider unconscious forces behind decision-making and behavior. It seems like a no-brainer these days. Everyone understands some basic version of the subconscious. The idea that your decisions can be affected by forces beyond your control or awareness is commonplace. But in Freud's time, it was genuinely revolutionary. Mental illness as a concept was barely considered, as all action and behavior were believed to be conscious. Freud was also the first to think about examining and treating mental conditions through talk alone. He basically invented the concept of modern therapy, and though the actual techniques have changed a lot, it's all still fundamentally based on his method. Like how a modern nuclear reactor is obviously an incredible development, but you can still very clearly see the direct lineage from James Watt's original steam engine. Without Watt, there's no nuclear power. Without Ada Lovelace, there's no iPhone. And without Freud, there's no cognitive behavioral therapy, a practice that has demonstrably improved the lives of millions of patients.